Well, welcome back to Rare Classic Cars and back by popular demand. My friend Mark here. I guess
you
friend.
keep saying that. I don't have any data to support that
That's
statement.
true.
Yeah.
Acquaintance, yes, yeah.
Oh, now, okay, we're distancing already. I see how this goes. Okay.
That's right, that's right.
Depends on how many clicks this video gets, right?
That's right. Friendship is proportionate to the number of clicks. So make sure you like, comment, and subscribe because it'll help.
They will comment.
They will comment, that's
Yes.
sure. Well, welcome again for a super interesting conversation here about Marc's 1967 Thunderbird and then juxtaposed with my 1969 Continental Mark III. So Mark,
It's sort of a parent-child relationship we get going here, a family dynamic.
It is a parent-child relationship because your vehicle, well, the four-door Thunderbird really was the underpinning for...
Well, the Thunderbird, the 67 Thunderbird platform, indeed. And this is the outcome of this mythological story, this legend, that Iacocca called up his chief designer, Gene Bourdonnais, one night. We don't know how inebriated he was, if at all, but you know, this was the 60s, so you never know. And he said to him, "Put me a Rolls-Royce grill and a Thunderbird." And voila.
Voila. It's pretty, I mean, it's funny that I think the designers probably didn't like that mandate.
No, they did not.
But the car ended up being quite a success and sold
quite a success is the understatement, because this, for better or for worse, a lot of people would argue for worse, informed American automotive styling trends for the next decade and a half and beyond, really.
Yeah, and it sold 30,000 units in its first year, 30,000 in 70 and 71. The Mark IV was more of a sales success, touching almost 50,000, but this really set the foundation for the Mark series kind of rebirth, which interestingly, Lincoln called it the Mark III, although there was a 58 Mark III.
Well, even back then they realized what happened between 58 and 60 was best, you know, glossed over and swept under the rug, so they ignored the fact that they already had a Mark III, 4, and 5 before. So the first thing is that this model is the so-called two-door Landau. The Landau, of course, being a throwback to what was called a landaulet, which was a vehicle where you could take the rear seat area and it had a convertible top on it. The front, where the driver sat back in the days before World War I even, where the driver sat was covered, but the rear area where the ladies and gentlemen that owned the vehicle sat was actually convertible. So they had these roof bows, of course, these linkages, and this is a reference to the Landau. A supreme piece of Iacocca kitsch, because apparently he was a big fan of these old school cliches, very controversial. I didn't like it at first because I didn't even look for this car. It just came across my bows and I had to have it because there was something about it. But over the years I've gotten used to it, and now I kind of like the fact that it has a vinyl top in the Landau bar because it's a quirk and it's not too off-putting. The standard coupe with a simple Thunderbird logo on the sail panel, that was a painted roof, of course, is cleaner. But I think this one is a bit more interesting and it fits the character of the car nicely. I think the thing that stands out right away is how low slung and how much different in character this car is compared to the Mark III. It's a very, very different car, even though they have the same underpinnings for the most part and a lot of the same parts, and we can point out a few of the same parts that they have and leave it for the viewers to judge how successful Ford was in changing the character of this car. But the character has really amazingly changed, I think. The Thunderbird, very low slung, very organic, smooth shapes, a lot of fairings, smooth transitions from the hood, very low, the belt line. The whole volume of the body is relatively slim and slender, and when you stand back a little and you see the side view, you realize how low the body side and perceived belt line is on this car, and how low slung and elegant the whole proportion is relative to the Mark III, which is a much chunkier and much more regal and much more formal form expression. The main thing here, of course, is they did everything to lower the real and perceived height of the car. One thing is that they put a strong accent line, a little fillet here below the belt line. They also broke up the body side with an upper and a lower surface with this sort of angled, the beveled surface here, which slims down the whole thing. Everything has a tubular, extruded look about it. The front end is a little reference to perhaps even the early 60s Oldsmobiles, which had sort of a shape within a shape.
Oh, like the 62?
62 Oldsmobile reference. That wasn't really what they were doing. It's just a shape cliche that designers sometimes work with, where you have a tubular enclosed shape that's kind of encapsulated in an outer shape, you know, so you have that going on here. That super clean look with concealed headlamps, which were all the rage in the mid-60s to the early 70s, especially at Ford. and it has this egg crate grill that has a little bit of that Phillips shaver look, and it looked very futuristic and spaceship-like, Spaceship 1967, and then it has a Landau bar as an accent. So a little bit of
how did they stamp that fender? I mean, that had to
with
have been
lots of care and love. I think that this fender is a wonderful example of what they could do. These were soft metals. I don't know how many hits they had today that would never fly, because you'd have to leave this thing in the tools for
7 or 8 hits.
7 or 8 hits. I don't know how they did it, but it's amazing what they did with the shapes. Very deep draws, a very long hood, nice power dome, nice little power accent on the hood here. Very, very elegant faded outline. The curvature of all the faded and blended lines on the car is very, very long and very elegantly done. This car has a lot of surface subtlety. And when I first brought it to one of our friends' big summertime parties, you remember Bob's
yes.
summer party, he had never seen this car. Bob, who's also a design director over at GM, and he commented on how interesting the surfacing, he had never seen one, or he didn't recall seeing one, and he was really intrigued by the surface elegance and the interesting details this car has. Another interesting thing is that this is the first use at Ford of this interesting multi-tiered line that goes around the window. You'll see that later in the 70s on the Torinos and the Starsky and Hutch era Torinos and a few other vehicles, where you have the DLO, the daylight opening the window, encapsulated by a form feature. Here we got the little ledge that runs out into the C-pillar and into the rear glass, and then you have another one starting that kind of fades in. You'll see a lot of variations of that on the early 70s Fords. This kind of motif stayed with them for a very long time, and here again it's used to bring the mass of the body side down, bring the volume of the body over the wheel opening down. You have a very handsome shape of the wheel opening. It's not round, it's sort of a squircle.
A little Cadillac-y?
Yeah, but I think this is its own thing. There's a little hint of the Tornado line in here, very, very little. It's actually more pronounced on the Mark IVs later on, but you do have a little hint of the Tornado line, very, very subtle, because that's something we take for granted in a lot of cars because it was copied a lot and there's a lot of variations of that around. But in the 60s, that was a relatively new form element that was used and modified over and over again. Here again, the blend of, there's a little bevel here, a little chamfer that catches light, again to reduce the mass and bring the car visually down. When you look closely through the vinyl top, there's a pretty broad strip of metal that has a crease, which is something that the Mark III is lacking. So this crease, again, reduces
I see. So there's a crease here.
And it continues here and blends into the deck lid, and it scoops into the deck lid here and becomes a slightly hollow and faded out feature here.
It's beautiful how that fades out. The Mark III doesn't do that at all.
Exactly. Everything on this car is done to make it flow and to bring it down visually and reduce the mass and make this car look as low slung and as low to the ground as possible.
No wheel opening moldings either on these.
Not these. This one has the optional side moldings. They came standard without them. Another factor that kind of bugs me a little bit, but on this car it doesn't. I'm so used to them now and I can't take them off. It has holes in the body. I would have to completely redo the body. So there's actual holes in the body for these. They're not glued on. So I'm going to leave them. And then of course we step to the back and we get a very, very beautiful rendition of the ultra-wide wall-to-wall tail lamp, which was a Thunderbird hallmark, was the big tail lamp cluster. In '66 was the first year when they walked from the left to the right side of the car in one continuous bezel. And in '67 through '71, that was probably the most styled and also, in my opinion, most beautiful interpretation. This one, we can show that later, has, of course, the famous sequential turn signals, which were pioneered by Thunderbird in 1965.
Look at that.
So yes, when we see this on modern day cars, the Audis and BMWs, and everybody's doing it now, but back in the day, this was certainly very, very different. And it's one of those kitschy American ideas that somehow made it throughout the entire world, and today it's tasteful when Audi does it.
I think Chrysler ended up buying that mechanism for the Imperial in '69 too.
They did. There were two iterations of this mechanism at the time. One was a transistorized one, I think, that was used in the Mercury Cougars. And the original one, started in '65, was an actual electromechanical one with a motor that had breaker cams on a shaft that rotated. So the wiring diagram of this car is bigger than that of a Boeing 747. It's absolutely ridiculous.
And the vacuum diagram.
And all of that. I mean, if it has a tube or a hose or a wire, it is probably 20 miles of it for each feature in this car. It is a nightmare to keep in perfect running order. And that was probably one of the reasons why these cars have disappeared over the years, because they were really nightmarish to repair. Pretty damn good cars when they were new, but of course this stuff wears out and then becomes economically unfeasible to repair, at least in the days when these were just used cars. Another feature that's interesting here, very subtle, but it's this sort of bow tie. The Thunderbird always had a reference to a pinched sort of little bow tie in the middle here, and this is a very subtle iteration of that. You'll see that again, not so subtle, on later Thunderbird expressions like the '77 one, or even the Fox-bodied Thunderbirds. They had a very, very large, very loud, very unsubtle dip in the center there to make that graphic. But that was one of the recognizable Thunderbird features, and here they have the tail lamps in one continuous line with the deck lid and the bumper pinching down to that little bow tie effect. That was a Thunderbird trademark.
Nicely integrated trunk lock cover there.
Beautifully integrated trunk lock cover. It's magnetic, so
it's magnetic.
It's magnetic, so it'll plop into place. Make sure it's down here. So the lock is right here. Little subtle fluting here. This is a die-cast piece. The die-cast pieces are in pretty decent shape on this car. A lot of the anodized aluminum has faded a little bit over the years, but overall the metal is in good shape on this car. Very nice, heavy, precise fittings. The backup lights are integrated under the Thunderbird, the bird here,
I love that.
the logo.
It's above and below the wing there.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece of sculpting art here, and very elegant, everything designed to stretch it out horizontally, make it look as wide and as slim as possible. Interesting feature, very overt here. You have a different iteration. The grill for the extractor vent.
The cigar extract smoke.
The cigar smoke extractor, the flow-through ventilation, pioneered on the 1964 Thunderbird, also brought to Ford of Europe and a few other products in the middle of the 1960s. Mercedes-Benz was one of the first companies to have a forced flow-through ventilation system in 1959 on their Fintail cars. Only the up-level ones, not the four cylinders, and only the bigger ones. And then by the mid-60s it became more or less a standard feature, but this was an active system because you have to turn it on. There is a vacuum door that you have to open, and you have to actively engage the system.
Same for the Mark III.
Correct, and that's interesting because most of these systems were done passively. If you look at some of the 1960s BMWs that had a beautiful extractor vent on the C-pillar, the coupes, that was a passive system. It was always on.
You can see the inlet here.
You can see the inlet, yeah. Or actually, that's the outlet, right? Because the inlet would be
fair enough. You're right. Yeah, you're right. Is at the front.
So the grill that extracts the air from the cabin and is connected here. One of the problems of this car is that there are two flexible tubes that run from the tulip panel underside, the plenum that holds this mechanism, down through the floor of the trunk into the area of the rear axle. It's supposed to drain moisture and water out, and on many of these cars they rot out, and so you end up with a lot of water in the trunk, and it's a hallmark of these cars. The floor of the trunk is completely water damaged or rusted out because of that. The owner's not noticing that the water was actually draining into the trunk instead of the ground.
It's amazing in comparing, like you said, there's a number of differences. One, all these subtle features that fade out.
Yes.
I mean, very nicely.
Look at the integration of the bumper here, the additional piece of molding, how complex that is, just to make sure that the bumper framing and the tail lamp framing and all the accents and the bezels that highlight these parts of the car are beautifully integrated.
So while it's the same chassis underpinning, at least this one's, I think, 3 inches shorter wheelbase because this is a two-door than the Mark III. Yeah. But it's amazing, like this one is so much more architectural. Like this one has a beautiful lead-in, you know, in the front.
So if you stand them side by side, I can point out a few things that are identical. For instance, you've got your cloth, your vinyl cloth wrapped over the A-pillar. This is the same part. The windshield moldings, the front glass, I think even the rear glass, and I believe part of this bezel here, I think that's the same. No, that's not the same part. There's actually a different part in the T-Bird. But the roof panel is the same as the four-door T-Bird, but the side panels are not, obviously. And you see that your belt line, instead of being lowered below the pillars, is raised up and creates that classic Lincoln trough with that peak line on the side. So it brings up the volume, visually, the volume of the car. So on the same basic
as
body,
opposed to
you have
slimming it.
Yes, you have a much more massive and more regal appearance, a much more imposing stance and presentation of the shape, rather than the Thunderbird, which is very low and sleek.
Very
and almost,
plebeian.
Yes, very common, very, very common.
You even have, it's funny, you have the butterfly wipers here.
I do. This one has opposing wipers, and this one has parallel wipers, which is an interesting, and they're both driven by the power steering pump, right?
Yes, they are.
Yeah,
they are.
So it's an interesting Ford had electric wipers later in the 70s, but in this vintage of T-Bird and Lincoln, they were actually hydraulic.
It works well because it's kind of a continuous.
It has variable adjustability for speed.
Exactly. So as opposed to intermittent that wipes at the same speed just after a delay, this wipes more slowly or more quickly.
So overall, very different character between the two cars. You probably want to take a little shot of your Lincoln in the foreground to just see how different in character these vehicles are.
It is interesting, like you said, like the Lincoln, it's much more upright and architectural. And
well, look what it does. Compare the rear quarters and how the C-pillar blends into the rear quarter of the car. The Thunderbird really has its accent down here. There's the brake and the bevel in the body side, and everything's drawn down below over the rear wheels. On this car, it's the reverse. They've pulled it up visually. They've omitted the crease in the body side here. They brought the eye-catching feature up high, and they actually brought the molding and the peak of this shape way higher. So this is probably sitting, I would say, 5-6 inches above. I mean, look at the difference here.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's a huge difference. And so this car has a completely different form character.
Amazing.
This one overtly and blatantly steals from Rolls-Royce in the character of the grille, and it was tremendously successful.
And it doesn't need big, bold badging because the grille is so big. It's very minimal badging.
We talked about when we discussed our Mark IVs, is that there's an interesting contrast between the bold form statements and the very subtle badging, the secondary stuff, the badges being very small, very delicate. So they were trying to evoke the emotion of high class and restraint, not in the shapes or the forms they picked for the cars, but in the secondary accoutrements, so to speak. And that was an interesting approach. So the other thing that's always wonderful to look at with the cars from this era is they had color. Yours is a beautiful maroon, and my Thunderbird is a color called burnt amber, which is seen occasionally. I've seen a few of these when they did pop up. There's quite a few that have survived in this color, probably because it is a beautiful color. It's one of the more intriguing color choices available in 1967.
But since I'm a color aficionado, this doesn't look quite right to my eye. You've done something to this.
Yes, well, you know that. You didn't figure this out because I told you. When I had the car repainted many, many years ago, 30 years ago, the car was faded. It was a Southern California car, and of course the paint was oxidized. I had it repainted in burnt amber, but I had the shop add a drop of silver to it, so it brightened it and made it almost a fawn color. It's subtle. I would never do this again today. I would today keep a car as original as possible, but in those days I was young, and you know, I was still sowing my wild car oats, so I had a drop of silver added to it, and I think it looks good.
Well, thank you, Mark. Stay tuned for part 2 of this video where we discuss the interiors of both vehicles and Mark demonstrates the famous Thunderbird tilt-away steering wheel.